Fighting is still going on in Panama City. The Americans say 19 of their soldiers have been killed and more than 100 wounded.
Although official figures list some 200 Panamanian civilians killed, locals here say the true figure is nearer 1,000.
We heard 2 bombs, bomb.
This man said, "Invasion is a crime. It's not justified. The Americans are just like the Russians."
Americans, he says, they lecture us on human rights, they send protests to Romania, then they turn round and bomb a small country like Panama.
We are very happy the United States will help us.
Do you think Noriega's finished now, President?
He was finished long time ago. He held his power by fear.
He revered fellow dictators like Gaddafi and Hitler, and yet treasured a personal benediction from the Pope.
The Vatican called the United States an occupying power in Panama today and said President Bush had no right to demand the release of the former dictator, General Noriega, from its embassy there.
If diplomacy can't move Noriega, why not try rock music, playing it at full volume outside the Vatican embassy, where he remains holed up.
Good morning, Panama!
The people here are calling for justice, but Noriega can't hear their cries. He's still being deafened by rock music, the tune currently playing, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Nowhere to Run.
Good evening. Thousands of American troops are tonight holding key positions in Panama after launching an attack early this morning to oust the dictator General Noriega. President Bush, appearing on television, said American forces were sent in to protect 35,000 American citizens in Panama. He said that General Noriega, who's still being hunted tonight, would be brought back to the United States to face drug charges. Before the Americans invaded, a new president, Senor Guillermo Endara, who was prevented from taking office after elections in May, was sworn in. At least 100 people have been killed in the fighting, including 11 American servicemen. One is missing and 59 have been wounded. The Americans also report the capture of 240 Panamanian soldiers.
There are also reports tonight that 61 hostages are still being held by Noriega loyalists in the centre of the city. More than 9,000 troops were airlifted into the capital from the United States, joining the 13,000 American troops already based there. The main force of today's attack was on General Noriega's military headquarters and his palace in the south of the city. The Americans called the attack Operation Just Cause. They declared it a success.
Today's US action is partly to ensure control of the Panama Canal stays sympathetic to the United States. The canal is operated and protected by the US now, but under the treaty, control goes to Panama in the year 2000. At the end of this year, a Panamanian takes over as Canal Commissioner. General Noriega might have held US trade through the canal to ransom the Americans feared. Though not elected president, Noriega has held the real power in Panama by using his military to manipulate the civilian politicians. The Americans accuse him of amassing wealth through drug running, yet they've been slow to move against him because he's been useful in the past. So what picture of Noriega has been built up? Born in 1934 in humble circumstances, he became head of intelligence and spied for the United States. In 1983, he became head of the army and effective ruler. 5 years later, a Florida grand jury indicted him on drugs charges and linked him with the Colombian Medellin cartel. In May this year, he lost a presidential election but refused to give up power. He survived a half-baked military coup and then declared war on the United States.
The White House ordered the troops in at 1 o'clock in the morning, Washington time. Thousands of men from military bases in the United States were on the move all night to reinforce the 12,000 already in Panama. Early reports about General Noriega's whereabouts were confused. He was first said to be leading his troops, then to have fled to an island off the coast of Nicaragua. But his headquarters, damaged in an October coup attempt, were reported to have been flattened. There's been fierce fighting in and around Panama City. A local doctor said he knew of more than 50 Panamanian dead, mostly civilians. One unconfirmed report said 10 Americans were killed. But newsmen found it virtually impossible to gain a clear picture of what was going on. It's still too early to predict the outcome of the fighting in Panama. and it's still not clear whether General Noriega will ever be brought to America to face drug charges. But Mr. Bush clearly hopes that Noriega's unpopularity will outweigh any sense of outrage over America's military action. Tim Hewitt, ITN, Washington.
Mrs. Thatcher was the first Western head of government to be contacted by President Bush after the invasion. She described the action as courageous. Mr. Kinnock said going in with the troops was the easy part. Coming out will be extremely difficult.
The democratically elected president was not allowed to take office. The country was riddled with drugs and the streets people walked with fear. Be supportive of a president who's had the courage to start to bring that to an end.
The Soviet Union condemned what it called America's act of aggression. It said the troops should be withdrawn. Mr. Bush sent a private message to Mr. Gorbachev just after the operation began.
In Moscow tonight, there is deep concern at the American action. The Kremlin has condemned it as a violation of the rights of a sovereign state.
The United States should stop its armed intervention in Panama immediately.
News from Panama quickly reached the Soviet parliament, where deputies denounced Washington's move.
It is a sad return to a situation, you know, of gunboats diplomacy, which I hoped we have already passed.
Americans, he says, they lecture us on human rights, they send protests to Romania, then they turn round and bomb a small country like Panama. It's Moscow's strongest condemnation of the United States for some time, and it comes less than a month after the two superpowers reached an understanding in Malta on the need for reducing regional conflicts. Bill Neely, News at 10, Moscow.
The Americans are our allies. The President rang up the Prime Minister. He explained the basis of the action. He explained something, of course, we already knew, that there'd been a fair election. The President Endara had been elected by the people of Panama, that he'd been shoved aside by the dictator, that the dictator had just recently said that Panama was at war with the United States, that they'd murdered an American officer and were threatening others. And the Prime Minister, I'm quite sure, was right, having listened to that, to say that we would support the American action to bring democracy back to Panama.
But hasn't the message of the last few weeks, few months here in Europe been that whatever the temptation, force is not going to be the answer?
The message of Eastern Europe is that people want free institutions, and that's true in Panama as well. And General Noriega was the obstacle to that.
The natural extension of that, then, is that we would advocate the violent overthrow of the Romanian president, for example.
There hasn't been a free election in Romania, and nor have the Romanians murdered American officers and threatened American troops, so the situation is not the same.
In Panama City, American troops have surrounded the Nicaraguan and Cuban embassies in their attempts to capture the ousted leader, General Manuel Noriega. In response, soldiers in the Nicaraguan capital, Managua, have now surrounded the American embassy there. Fighting is still going on in Panama City. The Americans say 19 of their soldiers have been killed and more than 100 wounded. They're offering $1 million reward for information leading to General Noriega's arrest. In Washington, the White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwalter pledged that troops would stay in Panama for as long as was necessary to find General Noriega and transfer power to the country's new government.
300 miles from Panama City, the dense jungle on the border could hide an army and a fugitive general. At the Panama border today, the crossing guards looked nervous, as if unsure who was in charge. They were getting their information from radio news. The general's picture still looks down the main street of this frontier town, which has one foot in Costa Rica, the other in Panama. Citizens of both sides were still free to come and go today, but journalists, especially Americans, were turned back onto the Costa Rican side. We walked onto the Panama side to ask people what they knew. They told us that there was a large contingent of pro-Noriega forces in the region and strong rumors that the general himself might be hiding near a town some 40 miles away. They were fearful. Perhaps the Americans will land here, one man said. God will decide what happens. I don't care if Noriega stays or goes, so long as they leave me alone. Others were more critical. This man said, invasion is a crime. It's not justified. The Americans are just like the Russians. Does he want Noriega to stay? It makes no difference. I just want peace, a Christmas with no war. The question these people want an answer to is who's in charge of their country. Is it General Noriega, who's believed to be hiding out in these hills somewhere, or is it the United States? And until that question's resolved, their feeling is that the less they say about this situation, the better. Ken Reese, News at 10, in Panama.
What was that last night? There was another very, very heavy bombardment of a popular area called Betania that, according to what I spoke recently, no one knows the justification. They're still killing our people. Sometimes I am appalled also that the British media doesn't care about the killing. They're only caring of if they find or not General Noriega. There are 28 children killed by the Americans. No one seems to worry about that. I mean, at least not the media.
But do you know where in the Republic of Panama General Noriega is? You do not know?
No.
Is he in the Nicaraguan embassy?
Nicaraguan embassy is not the Republic of Panama. It doesn't have anything to do with the Nicaraguan embassy.
Do you expect
that story is put out by the media or perhaps by the Americans in order to deny that he's in the country and that they have failed in the objective.
He's definitely in Panama today.
Of course he's in Panama. He spoke 2 times last night to the radio. And that's why the Americans bombarded a building and killed 2 radio men.
President Bush said he had to do it to protect American lives. Now, since General Noriega had declared war on the United States, surely the president was justified.
Well, the media has kept repeating that General Noriega declared war on the States. It seems to be that they're not checking very well what has happened in Panama. There is no declaration of war. That's a lie of Mr. Bush or the persons who are telling that.
Mr. Ambassador, General Noriega is an indicted drug smuggler. Don't the Americans have a right to try to bring him to justice?
No. First of all, according to even British lawyers, this indictment has no strength judicially. And also, you must remember that the American government has repeatedly offered to drop all charges. They have repeatedly offered General Noriega to forget about all this nonsense of drug things and to sort of give him a clean slate.
In Panama, troops loyal to General Noriega have attacked the American military headquarters. American forces are said to have fought off the attack. Officials at the Pentagon said tonight more American troops may have to be sent to Panama if the fighting continues.
Entire sections of the city, like the Barrios, lie in charred ruins. Many people have been left homeless. Yet while there are rich pickings for looters, there's a carnival air in town. All the major shops have been stripped bare, so have many luxury houses. But now, in the economic paralysis following the American invasion, there's hardly anything left. Despite the scale of the damage that was done to areas like this during the American invasion, it still seems to be greeted with enthusiasm. The question now for President Andara is whether he can meet their raised expectations. American soldiers are still experiencing a honeymoon on the streets as people greet them. But this queue of hundreds of people is waiting to buy goods at a supermarket, one of the few with anything left to sell. And armed vigilantes have taken to the streets in a bid to beat rising street crime. In scenes reminiscent of the Wild West, they round up suspects and hand them to the military. At General Noriega's office, preparations for Christmas were brought to an abrupt end. Poster-sized pictures of his heroes, Hitler and Gaddafi, await new owners. But while the Americans have got rid of the dictator, they must now fill the power vacuum he's left behind, or risk a slide into anarchy. Mark Webster, ITN, Panama City.
Other news now. Panama's General Manuel Noriega has taken shelter from the American forces at the Vatican's mission in Panama. US troops have surrounded the building, but so far the Vatican has shown no signs of giving him up.
The street celebrations began as soon as news came through that Noriega had sought refuge in the Vatican embassy. Troops surrounded the area as the US government began intense diplomatic negotiations to get him out. Despite the vast American effort to track down their most wanted man, they were perplexed at how he'd slipped through their fingers.
Sir, he's a very crafty man, as we found out. I'm not sure exactly how it worked.
His flight has left the Vatican with a delicate diplomatic situation to resolve. But today the church had other pressing pastoral considerations as the Archbishop of Panama toured the refugee camps, where thousands of homeless and hungry are being cared for. The new civilian president Endara also spread the Christmas message of hope and reconciliation, convinced that Noriega was now a spent force.
Do you think Noriega's finished now, President?
He was finished long time ago. He held his power by fear and sheer military power.
As the refugees celebrated Mass in the camps, the fugitive dictator was also seeking solace from the church this Christmas Day.
The Roman Catholic Church now finds itself with a key role in resolving the problems here, both at home in terms of unifying the nation behind President Endara, and internationally in helping to decide the fate of the fugitive General Noriega. Mark Webster, ITN, Panama City.
The Vatican has told America it can't see its way to hand over the deposed military dictator of Panama, General Noriega. Tonight, 4 civilian cars drew up outside the Vatican embassy in Panama City, where Noriega has taken refuge, causing speculation that he may soon be on his way into exile.
If diplomacy can't move Noriega, why not try rock music? The US Army enlisting David Bowie today, playing it at full volume outside the Vatican embassy, where he remains holed up. It's been a quiet day on the streets with no exchanges of fire. Instead, plenty of weapons have been exchanged. Some 40,000 handed over. The Americans are paying $150 for each gun. For some, the invasion came with a high price. Hundreds of people lining up today to enter refugee camps. Caught in the crossfire, many lost their homes and all their possessions, but few are complaining. As President Endara was at last declared the winner of the election stolen from him last May, more details were emerging of Noriega's bizarre lifestyle. He owned numerous luxury homes, one containing $5 million in cash, which was turned over to the new government today. He revered fellow dictators like Gaddafi and Hitler, constantly wore red underwear to ward off the evil eye, and yet treasured a personal benediction from the Pope. So the man who loved the good life is now living the simple life. In his small room in the Vatican embassy here, he's said to be a broken man, taking comfort from the Bible. The man who had his choice of luxury homes now has no home at all, and so far, no one willing to offer him one. Ken Reese, News at 10, Panama City. The constant activity around the papal embassy has brought no sign of an end to the standoff. Military officials and diplomats come and go, talks continue. But there are signs that General Noriega is becoming increasingly isolated. His lawyers have all but abandoned him. Intelligence experts who tapped into his phones report frantic calls to banks around the world. In the village of Veracruz, once tightly controlled by Noriega loyalists, the US Marines are now firmly in charge. But restoring law and order won't come easily. A week ago, these people were members of Noriega's police force. Now, after careful screening, they have been rehired and are working alongside the US troops. The hope is that within a short time, the locals will be able to take over on their own. People said they were relieved to see the joint patrols on the streets, but still worried at what might happen when the troops eventually pull out. So far, these joint patrols have been a great success, but the real test will come later when the 60 US Marines who are based here pull out and leave the Panamanians to defend themselves. Ken Reese, ITN, Veracruz, Panama. The General's wake-up call came early today, blasting across the city on Army loudspeakers amid reports that the last 4 of those who had sought refuge here with him had come out, leaving him alone to hear the bad news.
Vatican embassy where Noriega continues to hide out. They say he's a criminal. He's a common crook.
While the Americans buzzed the area with noisy helicopters, efforts to resolve the standoff continued. Panama's new president appealed to Vatican officials to change their mind and hand him over. But it seems the church still has faith in diplomacy.
We heard 2 bombs, bomb, bomb.
People here are still counting the human cost of the invasion. Although official figures list some 200 Panamanian civilians killed, locals here say the true figure is nearer 1,000, and grieving relatives are still searching the rubble. This burnt-out mattress silhouetted with the ashes of the person who died here. A makeshift memorial stands where people wait near the Vatican embassy. Panamanians who want to see justice done. But so far there's no sign of Noriega coming out. The people here are calling for justice, but he can't hear their cries. He's still being deafened by rock music, the tune currently playing, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Nowhere to Run. Ken Reese, News at 10, Panama City.
The Vatican called the United States an occupying power in Panama today and said President Bush had no right to demand the release of the former dictator, General Noriega, from its embassy there. A Vatican spokesman said international law meant America could not interfere with the work of a diplomatic mission. In the last half hour, the United Nations General Assembly has adopted a resolution deploring the United States intervention in Panama.
The racket outside the embassy clearly angered the Vatican, who called it American harassment. The campaign to use rock music to drive out Noriega went on all night and this morning. It was so loud that even people living a quarter of a mile away had a sleepless night. Conversation was almost impossible. The Vatican did make themselves heard today, though. In the strongest language yet, their spokesman made it clear they were in no mood to hand Noriega over to the United States.
An occupying power cannot interfere with the work of a diplomatic mission, nor demand that a person seeking asylum in that mission be handed over to it.
The Vatican say they are trying to persuade the general to leave on his own. They're also continuing to talk to the Americans and the Panamanians, but there's no sign of a breakthrough, and not even a glimpse of Noriega himself, who may now be completely isolated after the surrender and arrest of 4 of his companions yesterday. Only the nuncio's staff and 3 nuns remain, and living conditions are said to be Spartan. And so far, it seems no one else is willing to offer him sanctuary. The Vatican said today that there are no negotiations going on with any other countries that might take him. And that includes Cuba, Nicaragua, Spain, and even Venezuela. So for now, General Noriega remains an unwelcome guest of the Vatican, and although they've turned the volume down a little outside his window, the band still plays on. Ken Reese, News at 10, Panama City. After 3 days of blasting rock music at Noriega, they finally turned it off. The only visible result had been some priestly aerobics in the embassy garden. In an effort to break the deadlock here, Panama's Catholic bishops have appealed to the Vatican to release Noriega to the Panamanian authorities. They say he's just a crook and doesn't deserve sanctuary on political or humanitarian grounds. Ken Reese, ITN, Panama City. On this last day of the year, the U.S. Army have been trying to coax the last remaining Noriega loyalists out of hiding. They were competing with Panamanian citizens, trying their own appeal to the former dictator near the Vatican embassy. Others prayed for a solution, but some Catholics stayed away from Mass today, angry that the church is sheltering Noriega. Their priests read out a letter from the country's bishops. It asks the Pope to hand the former dictator over for prosecution. President Ndara took communion with his countrymen today and then stayed on to receive their blessings. I asked him how long he thought the deadlock would continue.
I hope that in the next few days we'll be able to. He has no right to be there. He's a common criminal.
And what will you do with him? Will you hand him over to the Americans?
We have no possibility of giving him due process. We hope that the Americans get him before we do.
But there is confusion in the new government. The Attorney General saying today he wants Noriega handed over to him to face murder charges.
We will try anyone who commits a crime.
In the embassy garden today, they were still talking, still hoping to negotiate a way out. That would have to include a way past the American Welcoming Committee still lined up outside the gates. The Vatican is still praying that Noriega will listen to their pleas and give himself up. But so far, there's no sign that Panama's most wanted man is about to do that. Ken Reese, ITN, Panama City. As news of his departure spread through Panama City, an instant party hit the streets. At last, the one-time dictator was out of the country.
Well, you don't need to know what these people are saying to realize what their emotions are. They knew they had him on the run, but now at last, Manuel Noriega is gone, and the people of Panama City are celebrating.
We are very happy to the United States will help us
Ignoring the curfew, Panamanians savoured the moment. Their country still has many problems to solve, but the biggest problem of all disappeared during the night. Ken Reese, ITN, Panama City.
The Pentagon this evening released the first pictures of the arrest of Manuel Noriega. He demanded no media be present as one of the conditions of his surrender, but a Defense Department cameraman filmed him at Howard Air Force Base in Panama. It was an unceremonious departure for the former military strongman, surrounded by men from the Drug Enforcement Agency. Noriega was flown back to the United States in a giant C-130 transport plane, which took nearly 6 hours to lumber its way to Florida. As the White House celebrated his surrender today, George Bush telephoned Pope John Paul to discuss America's treatment of the man who'd sheltered in the Vatican embassy. Despite criticism abroad, the American public strongly supported the invasion of Panama. Mr. Bush's reputation has now been even further enhanced. But already a new debate is beginning. Will the case against Noriega stand up in court? Can he really get a fair trial? Tim Hewitt, ITN, Washington.
In Miami, Noriega himself was still being held in a highly secure underground cell known as the Submarine. He's said to be in good spirits following his undignified exit from Panama. His defense team was at the court today. They shared a packed lunch in his cell and discussed legal strategy. They believe they don't need deals to prove that their client is innocent. Although it's not even officially admitted that Noriega is still here, he'll have to stay in his basement cell in this courthouse until a suitable federal prison can be found to house him. The authorities are acutely aware of the security risks for a man who may not even face trial for at least a year. The drugs traffic in which Noriega is implicated has partly fueled Miami's economic boom of the past decade. Cocaine is to Miami what motorcars are to Detroit, but the drugs business is thriving. The Colombian drugs barons have bought heavily into the local real estate market, making legitimate business empires out of narcotics. Noriega's arrest is a setback for the drugs barons, but they'll recover.
This is a victory. This is very significant, but this doesn't turn the corner. This is just one small piece in the puzzle, and we're certainly very fortunate that this happened, and we're glad to see that it happened. However, we're not expecting to see immediate results from something like this.
Press freedom returns to Panama. This morning, the newspaper La Prensa enjoyed publication without government intimidation. The first edition since the day Noriega's troops smashed up its offices, closed the paper, and forced its editor into exile in the United States.
It was emotional coming back after 4 years of exile, and emotional seeing the destruction of the newspaper, emotional now seeing that we've been able to put it together with band-aids and so forth to get it out. It will be our first issue in liberty.
But it's a fragile liberty, very dependent on a foreign power. For troops still surround La Prensa's offices. Only this time, they're American troops, here to protect, not intimidate. On the streets of Panama City, where La Prensa appeared for the first time today, US troops are also very prominent. But for local businesses, the recovery will take much longer. Insurance companies argue the looting after the US invasion was an act of war. And firms now hope hundreds of millions of dollars in American aid will save Panama from economic chaos. Some, of course, cannot recover. Behind the neatly tended plots of the local cemetery, a mound of earth conceals a mass grave. 40 yards long, 4 yards wide, for the untold civilian casualties. Nobody knows how many people were buried in this mass grave. The Americans say that 250 civilians died overall. Others put the figure much higher. Some say it could be more than 1,000. Many of them died in the flattened El Chorrillos slum area, hit during the US attack on Noriega's headquarters. But locals feel no resentment towards the Americans. Far from it. Most of the destruction was by Noriega's dignity battalions, who went round burning and killing afterwards. Now El Chorrillos inhabitants are among the 12,000 in refugee camps depending on American help. Help they also expect in the long term. Who do you think is going to give you a new home?
Los americanos.
The gringos will give me a new house, he says. And indeed, President Bush has indicated he is willing to help rebuild. But if US help isn't forthcoming quickly or in sufficiently generous quantities, it could easily restoke the fires of popular anti-American nationalism that have helped military dictatorships in Panama for so long. These are some of the very men that protected dictatorship. Former members of Noriega's notorious PDF, now recruited into Panama's new public forces, a ramshackle police body that hardly inspires confidence. In Panama's slums this weekend, they began joint walking patrols with US soldiers, the Panamanians in green, the Americans in camouflage. But neither side really seemed to understand the other's language. The Americans, though, are still very much in charge.
We're trying to get them away from things like taking bribes. We've already informed them that I expect the same standard of the Panamanians as I expect of my own soldiers. Take a bribe, you go to jail. You don't take anything for free from store owners or the people. And already the people are starting to respect the Panamanian policemen more than they ever did before.
But the dangers of alienating the very men the new government will depend on are appreciated by the Panamanian leader, whom last May the world saw beaten up by Noriega's men.
Of course, we need a period of adjustment because you cannot change a soldier into a policeman. We don't want them to feel that we're hitting their dignity because they belong to the Panamanian people and they're swearing in a good oath, not to President Ndara, but democracy and the Constitution.
This morning, another 700 of the US invasion troops returned home. More than 4,000 of the original 14,000 have now gone back. And America's top general says the others will go within weeks. But the Panama Canal means thousands of other US soldiers will still remain. This waterway and the railway that preceded it across the Panamanian Isthmus have been protected by the US military for 150 years. Under the Canal Treaty, American soldiers can stay until 1999. But the canal itself may no longer provide the main motive for their continued presence. Protecting the canal was one of the reasons that President Bush gave for invading Panama. The fact is, though, that for the Americans, the canal is by no means as important as it once was, thanks to better road and rail links within the United States. But the 7 American bases here provide a valuable headquarters for Southern Command, coordinating US military operations for Latin America. And many believe that for that reason, the Americans may try to stay beyond 1999. Among them, a former US Attorney General who's been highly critical of the US invasion.
Certainly the timing, the technique, the propaganda effort that went into it would suggest that, as with Clark Air Force Base and Subic Naval Station in Panama, that in the Philippines, that the United States government, or at least certain segments of it, are very anxious to retain authority and presence here.
The skyscrapers of Panama City symbolize perhaps how Panama has come under the influence of the United States more than any other Central American country. Panama doesn't even have its own independent currency. Everything here is done in US dollars. But last year's car number plates show how General Noriega played on Panamanian aspirations for full sovereignty by the year 2000. A poll conducted last week showed that Panamanians now expect America to stay beyond then. But the new government isn't willing to agree to that in a hurry.
We have not been asked by the United States. We have not offered any revision to the treaty. The nationalization of the Panama Canal is a test that we're going to perform, and we have the assurances of President Bush that that will be the case.
So after 1999, there won't be any American troops here?
What I'm saying is that we're not going to change the treaty, and in order to have truth beyond that, they will have to change the treaty. If a future government wants to do it, they have to go to the Panamanian people, take it to a plebiscite, and get an approval.
In the present climate, such approval would almost be certain, for it's almost impossible to find a Panamanian with a bad word against the Americans. But as Panama recovers from the ruins of dictatorship, its leaders could find that if America stays too long, its sovereignty may not only be threatened, but the strong nationalist forces exploited by Noriega could so easily re-emerge. Michael Crick, ITN, Panama City.